people who argued it was all about free trade. That as we move toward free trade, allowing less developed countries to ship cheap goods into the United States, this put tremendous downward pressure on wages among primarily less skilled workers. And so less skilled workers get whacked down because of free trade. Winner-take-all labor markets raise the wages of a few people in the top 1%. Linked to that would be capital mobility. Not that there's just free trade, but now companies, as a result of technological innovation in transportation and communications, found it much easier to move to other countries. And as a result, they could move some of their operations to take advantage of lower cost labor abroad while keeping their high-skilled production at home. Again, leading to this growing inequality between the top and the bottom. And then a ninth suspect was immigration. We're going to hear a lot about that in a couple weeks, or 3 weeks when we have our immigration panel. And the idea was, well, the problem is that we've opened the doors up, people are coming across the border, most of those people are coming with relatively few skills. There are some very skilled workers, but most of them with less skilled workers, and those less skilled workers are competing with domestic, naturalized citizens, and the result is driving down wages at the bottom. And then finally, suspect number 10, just trade deficits. We were just running huge trade deficits, which was slowing down the overall economy, and that was affecting income. Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. X minus M is where the trade deficit is. That reduces overall growth rates. With slower growth, the argument was it adversely affected particularly at the bottom. Indeed, I was at a number of conferences, including one at the New York Fed, which dealt with these issues, and there was a lot of discussion among economists about, is it technology, is it deindustrialization, is it declining unionization? And having listened to all of it, I remember just standing up and saying, the only way we could explain such dramatic declines is the Agatha Christie answer, they all done it. Well, we're going to hear a lot more about some of those things in the weeks to come. Before we turn to Professor Shapiro from Brandeis, I just want to add a little bit more. And that is, there are two very distinctly different issues that we want to deal with here. One is the question of inequality. And you could argue that inequality is bad. Or you could argue it's good. Whether inequality is really a problem or not has a lot to do with the question of whether people remain permanently in the spot where they are. If you could imagine a world in which there's a lot of inequality, but from year to year, or at least generation to generation, you switch places, it wouldn't be half as bad. If you thought you could begin at the bottom and make it to the top, inequality may be even something that you'd enjoy. When you do surveys to people, particularly low-income people, and say, would you like to see a highly graduated income tax where there are 70% income taxes, as we had under the Kennedy administration, on rich people, most poor people say no, on the basis that they have the belief that if they ever get there, they don't want to have to pay a 70% tax. So the question is how much mobility do we actually have? Well, not as much as I might like. Between 1969 and 1979, if you looked at 25 to 34-year-olds and asked what happened to them over the decade, it turns out that a very large proportion remain in the same quintile of income as they began. So if you began, the way to read this, if you began in the lowest quintile in 1969, you had nearly a 50% chance of still being there 10 years later. That's the 49.4% that you see in the top left column. About 25% of those people who began in the lowest quintile in 69 ended up in the second lowest quintile. They did a little bit better. But only 3.3% of them were able to move from the poorest quintile to the highest quintile. And only about 12% were able to move into either the fourth or fifth quintile. It also turns out that your chances of declining are not very good either. About 49% of the people who started in the top quintile that's the bottom right number, 49.1%, stayed there 10 years later. And only 5% of them who started in the top quintile ended up in the bottom quintile, and they would probably be the subject of some very interesting stories. What do you have to take to move from the top quintile to the bottom? And it probably has to do with things like health, disability, or getting in trouble with the law or something like that. Well, let's see how much better we did in terms of looking at this over time.
Were those numbers based on the same people, or were there
Those are the same people. Those are longitudinal studies. Very good question. Are those the same people? Yes. Those are studies where they follow the same people over 10 years. So we want to know you, Mary Jo, where are you 10 years later? Okay? So we then looked at the same question and asked, what are your chances of this happening, and how has this mobility changed over time? And so this study looked at 84 to 94, and then looked at 94 to 2004. These are two 10-year periods apart. And it turns out, as you see in this chart, there really isn't very much change at all. If anything, your probability of moving into the top quintile, if you're start in the bottom quintile, is actually lower, 3.5%. It's the bottom red, your far right, bottom 3.5% red bar, as opposed to 4.6% in the year before, in the 10-year decade before.
I assume you're going to get to this, but intergenerationally, like the person himself or herself may not be able to advance, but that their child is
right.
able to.
I don't actually have those statistics with me, right? But we do have some. They're harder to get because you need longitudinal studies that go over 30 years, and we have very few of those. That's the problem. So how about relative mobility to the bottom quartile? What are your chances of starting out and, starting at the top and getting to the bottom? Again, not much change there. It seems to be fairly static. And here's another way of putting it. You saw the chart a little bit before. You'll see now, 1989 and 1998, when we do that study a decade later, if anything, you have about the same probability of moving from where you are. People get stuck. They don't move very far. One of the questions that we might ask is, what are the characteristics associated with leaving the bottom quintile, right? So we're looking at ages 25 to 34, aging to ages 35 to 44, 10 years later. Well, your probability of leaving the bottom quintile and ending up in the second, third, fourth, or fifth quintile, you're about 8.2% more likely if you're a male, if you're white, than if you're non-white. So whites have a little bit more mobility. You have about 5% greater chance if you're a male rather than a female. You have about a 6% chance of moving up if you at least finish high school. You have about a 6.6% chance of moving up if you're a homeowner. If you live with your spouse, your chances of moving up is about 1%. If you are able to control your own hours, as opposed to have your hours fixed by your employer, you get a big boost of about 12.5%. And there's something on spouses being able to control their hours. But look at the one that really makes the big difference, according to this. It's if you get more than a high school education. Going to college makes a big difference in your mobility chances. So you can have some people who somehow get to Northeastern, even though they come from very low income families, and they're able to move up as a result of education. And over again, what you're going to hear, particularly when we look at education in a few weeks with our guests, is that education is the answer, right? And that's why you hear so much about Deval Patrick saying we're going to hold education safe from the cuts. We have the President of the United States trying to pour more money into education. It is seen not only as good for growth, but it is seen as important for mobility. Right? Now, this is another way of looking at it. What happened to the percent change in real hourly wages by education between 1973 and 2005? Well, we saw the inequality by quintiles. Now we're doing it by education. If you have less than a high school education, On average, those people lost 16%, or people like them lost 16%. High school went nowhere, lost 2%. Some college gets you a little bit. What you really want to do is finish college. That gives you about a 17.5% increase in your wages, and an advanced degree gets you about 24%, between 73 and 2005. Okay? Well, what about the characteristics associated with entering the bottom quintile? So you start in the second, third, fourth, or fifth quintiles. What are the chances that 10 years later you're in the first quintile, the bottom one? Well, if you're white, your chances are 7.7% less than if you're non-white. So your chances of downward mobility are somewhat lower. Your chances of downward mobility are somewhat lower if you're a male. Your chances are somewhat lower of being downwardly mobile if you're a homeowner, if your spouse lives with you, or if there's another adult. But the thing that really whacks you is disability. If you become disabled, your chances of falling into the bottom quintile become much greater. So, according to this study, education is the way out. Remaining healthy is the way to keep from declining. How does the United States do relative to other countries? Well, here is data for 2006 in terms of intergenerational mobility. This is intergenerational. And the way the authors did this is they fixed the United States at 1, okay? And our mobility is about the same as the United Kingdom. But these other countries, mostly they're all Northern European countries except Canada, as you'll see, have significantly higher intergenerational mobility than we do, right? Essentially 3 times greater chance of being able to move out of your quintile if you live in Denmark than if you live in the United States, 2.5 times more likely to move out of your quintile if you live in Canada or Finland. So the United States not only has a pretty unequal distribution of income, and indeed, if we had the data, if I would show it, less unequal than many of these other countries, but intergenerational mobility is also less. Okay? Finally, wealth, and this is where we're going to go in a few more minutes with Professor Shapiro. Let's take a look. We've been only talking about income so far, right? Income that you get in wages, and you get in interest and dividends and so forth. But wealth, of course, takes into account things like financial assets, the ownership of a home, the ownership of other assets. Well, in 2004, the bottom 90% of the population had about 17% of all household income, right? The top 1% had about 17% of all income. The bottom 90% had about 58% of all income. Okay? So, inequality, right? But if you look at net worth, the top 1% had more than 1/3 of total net worth. That's assets minus debt. And if you looked at net financial assets, you look just at things like stocks and bonds. The top 1% had about 42% of all wealth. The bottom 90% had only about 19%. Right? Moreover, if you look at 1962 to 2004, the wealth distribution, like the income distribution, has gotten somewhat more unequal. So the top 1/5 had about 80%, about 4/5 of all net worth in 1962. It was up to 85% by 2004. And finally, if we look just at stock market holdings, we'll see that the top 1% has about 37%, the next 9% have about 42%, the bottom 40%, although we supposedly are all capitalists now, only own about 0.6% of all stock market holdings.
Does that count stocks that are held as part of pension plans?
It is,
401ks?
and it's been attributed through 401ks and other things to others. So that gives you an idea of what we're talking about. So far, up to today, we were talking about growth. Now we have some numbers, and now we're going to go on and take a look at work that Tom Shapiro. Professor Shapiro is the Pokross Professor of Law and Social Policy at the Heller School, and an old friend of ours because he was for more than 20 years, 25 years in the sociology department here at Northeastern University. And when I have to tell you, and I've never told this to Tom, when I first got to Northeastern 10 years ago this month, or last month, Tom was about the first person I met, and because of his work and his friendship, I knew I was in the right place.
Yeah.
Tom Shapiro.